welcome to today's event. So this is going to be led and presented by Jenny Hanlon, CFO at Adnams, who will be presenting on an FD CFO's role in the boardroom. So what I'm going to do is just pass you over to Jenny now, and yeah, I hope you enjoy the presentation. I know I'm looking forward to it. Thanks, Jenny.
Hi everybody, good afternoon. As I've already been introduced, Jenny Hanlon, CFO at Adnams. I apologise I don't have a suitably motifed background, but I can't work it out in Zoom. I can only do it in Teams. Still clearly things to learn even after we're in this remote environment. So I just wanted to spend a bit of time chatting with you today about the role of the CFO in the boardroom. Why do I pick this? I guess the reason why I picked this topic to present on, I joined CFO role at Adnams just over 2 years ago. And prior to that, I was a CFO in a number of different industries. And I think it became really clear in arriving in this particularly new role that there is a very, very different angle to how you can be a CFO and an effective CFO in a boardroom. And hopefully, as I walk through this presentation, you'll understand what I mean. And I would think that many of you probably understand a load of this already. I'm incredibly conscious that I'm talking to probably a very wide variety of CFOs and finance directors in terms of depth of experience, tenure in role, and the organisation and type of industry that you're in. I have no intention, oh, apologies, I'm struggling with putting my next slide up. There we go. I have no intention of telling anyone how to suck eggs, because I'm sure you can all do that already. This session is more about provoking a bit of thought, consciously raising awareness of some of the aspects of being effective in the boardroom. And above all, highlighting the need for every CFO to spend some time thinking about this and the various elements that I'm going to chat through. I guess in the boardroom, you know, you're on show, you need to be prepared. Probably a bit like I like to think I'm prepared for this presentation today. But before we get started, I just wanted to cover a little bit of admin. I'm keen people feel comfortable sharing their experiences. So I know I'm stating the obvious when I say Chatham House rules apply, but I really do want people to feel that they can talk through some of their own experiences, as indeed I will talk through some of my own as well. I don't intend doing this as a standard presentation where I'm going to talk at you for 15, 20 minutes. Everybody saves up their questions and we'll talk through them both at the end. What I'd like to be able to do is, after each section that I talk through, I'll give everybody opportunities to be able to chip in, add an observation, add an experience, ask for some advice. You know, let's make this as interactive as possible. But at the same time, the chat room facility will be switched on. So if there is something that you'd like to ask, but you think it can be saved to the end, then do feel free that you can do it that way. Or if indeed you're not keen on just jumping in the middle of the presentation. But I won't be offended if people want to interrupt me, okay? You are all automatically muted, so just bear in mind you might need a bit of time to unmute yourself if you do want to jump in with a question, and I'll try and speak slowly for that bit. I am aware I can speak quite quickly, but please feel free to unmute yourselves and jump in. So without further ado, let's do the easy bit first. I want to talk through about how well you know yourself, and some of you will probably happily admit you know yourself quite well, and some of you will probably think they're like thinking about that. But in your role in the boardroom, it is so important to understand what your key strengths are in that boardroom. Do you like presenting? Do you think you're a good presenter? Do you actually really enjoy it and revel in that moment of sharing that information and getting people to understand what you're wanting to talk about? It's important to know that, do you think you're better having lots of information in front of people, or you just want a couple of salient points and you ad-lib it? And indeed, those people in the room, how receptive they are to your approach. Do you consider yourself an interpreter or a thought provoker? Or do you want people to understand what has happened, what needs to happen, and what could happen? Are you an individual who is passionate about what you do, or are you a little bit more reserved? Are you analytical? Do you have a tendency to present data into a bit too low a level of detail? You feel like sometimes you might lose the room and losing the message that you convey. And I think it's important that you all ask these questions of your own style, so that rather than them being an unconscious thought process, you can consciously address them, bring them into that zone of your thought process, so that you can take any appropriate action if you need to. So I said I speak really, really quickly. I try very hard to speak very, very slowly. And I know that I don't always do that. So it's just awareness is key. And that consciousness, bringing it into the front of your mind, will actually give you far more confidence as well when you're actually standing there in the boardroom. We can talk about getting passionate about a topic. So if you are a passionate presenter, you can become a bit too exuberant about your topic. You stop reading the room, you could therefore miss a key cue off somebody, or worse, you don't notice when a fellow board member is actually trying to add something into the conversation. Or if you are reserved, you could get over-talked, even if you're covering an important topic, and you might not feel confident enough in how you actually kind of pull that conversation back. So practicing some useful cues as to how you can get back into the meeting without feeling uncomfortable about how you're interrupting someone can be an incredibly useful kind of set of notes that you can always have on the back of your hand if you need them. And if you identify any areas of concern or gaps in your ability to deliver your content in the boardroom, then proactively seek out ways to fill that gap. Is it something that you can change? Can you tailor your approach to minimise your exposure to it? Can you ask a fellow board member or a non-exec director for assistance, depending on who those individuals are? Can you go and get some external training? We're at that point where we can quite quickly forget. We consciously are training our teams all the time, wanting them to get through their accounting qualifications and all of that sort of stuff. And we inadvertently forget about ourselves and the fact that it's okay for us to go, do you know what, I want to go and learn about something, please. It's this particular piece. And I guess the second area when you're looking at yourself that I think it's important to look at is your own tenure. Are you new to the organisation? Do you need to find out some intel about how the board meetings usually operate? People like the company secretary and the CEO can be quite good at that as to what their normal rationale as to how they balance themselves in those meetings. In looking at your tenure, you can then also sort of think about your own experience, not just tenure in that particular organisation or even in that particular role. You might have been in the organisation for 10 years, but you've actually new to the role, or you might have been a CFO in lots of different organisations for many years, and understanding how the benefits from some of that experience comes into play can be really, really useful. And indeed, I guess if you've done a lot of different CFO roles, you've probably got a few scars, experiences that can be really valuable in how you then address a new CFO role. Always nice to start with a clean slate. So use those experiences and grow from them. I always think one of my key points I always think about is in when you're looking at, say, someone when they make a mistake, absolutely great if you make a mistake, because as long as you learn by it, then it was worth it. But repeating a mistake seems a bit of a painful experience, and probably one that no one will thank you for. Well, perhaps you've been in a role for many years. Ask yourself, are you as fresh and as illuminating as it could be? It's really easy to fall into a standard pattern or making assumptions about what you're reporting on. And I guess when you're new into role, you get that wonderful 6-month period of being able to, one, ask some really stupid questions and not look stupid. 2, ask the questions that loads of people thought people should have been asking but never really did ask. And 3, that fresh set of eyes, that it's such a valuable time period. So how do you kind of make yourself, if you've been doing the role for 10 years, kind of, almost walk away and think, how, if you kind of removed all the brand imagery or, your underlying knowledge of the business, how would you read your CFO report cold? What would be the question that Ned in the corner would ask? It's those kinds of things. It's a discipline, yes, but I think the crucial element of that discipline is giving yourself time to prepare and not just thinking, oh, it's the board meeting, I'll just nip in, I've done my slides, sort of thing. You need to give yourself some really good time to prep. Then there's understanding kind of your aspirations. Do you plan on staying in your current role for the foreseeable future? Are you using this to gain maximum experience before taking on a larger CFO role somewhere else? Or do you want to be the CEO of that organisation one day? In the boardroom, there's an opportunity to show all the board members what you're capable of. So use that stage. If you need to, and it's the right time to do so, it's there for the taking. So again, just thinking about what are you wanting to get out of the experience as well. I think it's also important to, I briefly mentioned about training, it's important to continue your own professional development. It always seems to get set by the side because you have a team who are going through qualifications, so the focus tends to be on that. It's okay to sort of say, I'm going to have some training for me, please. And indeed should be embraced by the organisation you're in. And it doesn't necessarily at CFO stage, it doesn't have to be in even something that's particularly finance. It can be in broadening your own experiences outside the organisation, taking on a pro bono NED role. The breadth of experience that you get in other boardrooms, in other executive roles, will add depth and experience to what you bring to the boardroom in the job that you're paid to do on a Monday to Friday basis. So please give yourself the opportunity for looking at things that might interest you. And there's always kind of other organisations as well that, they might be someone who, like the CBI, for example, can have good opportunities in getting involved and just, again, adding a bit more depth, getting involved in giving feedback that goes directly to government. All of that sort of stuff can really, really help you in where you are and how you're presenting in the boardroom. And indeed, some of the messaging that you might have inadvertently missed because you just haven't thought of it. So let's take some, so I think moving on, we want to take some time to go get to know each board member. When I joined Adnams, I had a couple of one-on-one sessions with each board member. No fixed agenda other than just want to get to know you. Some of them might be coffee in my office. Some of them would be, I work at Southwold. I'm lucky enough to be down by the beach. One of the board members has a beach hut, so we went and sat in the beach hut and had a cup of tea there for half an hour. Get to know those individuals. What makes them tick? How do you think that they operate individually? What's their way of learning? How do they want to understand the business? What do they think they see your role as in the business? Do they prefer data prior to the meeting, a bit of chance to digest it? They might want a couple of meetings randomly with you individually just to chat through some of the detail, whereas others will be probably lighter touch. They'll digest the information themselves and they won't necessarily want loads of interaction. But understanding that individual enables you to pick up on their cues in the boardroom, help you maybe not fall down a rabbit hole somewhere, or even get some support where you need it in getting a message across and getting other people to understand whether it's important or not. I know I always scrutinise the financial pages of any board meeting I go to, whether it's one that I'm presenting at or whether it's one that I'm attending for a different organisation. So it's always helpful to know, if you've got, I've got 2 non-execs who are previous CFO individuals, and that means that I always walk into a boardroom thinking they're going to ask me a couple of perler questions. I better be prepared. But understanding, are they an individual who likes to catch you out? Are they a critical friend? Are they supportive? We can aspire to make sure everyone supports and pulls together. But I'm sure we've all had experiences of where individuals in the boardroom aren't necessarily as helpful or supportive as we'd all wish they were. So being aware of how people conduct themselves is quite crucial. Let me think. So,
just a quick one, Jenny. It's Malcolm from EFM. I'm a portfolio finance director.
Oh,
and
right,
I find one of the best, so I sit on a lot of boards, fairly early stage, very unsophisticated boards.
Yeah.
I find the best way to get feedback is to ask either the non-execs or the investors what they want, because the management team often don't know what good looks like anyway.
Yeah, no,
and
really
therefore,
valuable.
and asking, is what I'm doing all right?
Yep.
Is this the right answer?
Yeah, no, I think really valuable. Always be willing to ask for feedback, because how are you going to make what you're doing better? And indeed, how are you going to know? Well, I guess some people at board won't necessarily feel that they want to share with you some points that could help you, even though they've got some good ideas. So great to invite it. And actually, as a portfolio finance director, you get a fantastic breadth of experience in how people do or don't do things, or indeed, you can take some good practice and share it around. So you normally find it can be quite an open forum for that, don't you?
Yeah, it's normally how not to do things, particularly because we're in early stage businesses and they don't really understand what good looks like.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Sorry, apologies. I seem to I've lost a valuable page from my notes. Apologies while I just rethought myself. Right, so let's move on to knowing your board. So I touched on this. So the individuals on the board, you meet them, you've had your chat, you've got to feel what their personalities are like. LinkedIn sounds really obvious. Have a good look on LinkedIn at what some of these guys have done. The individuals, they may, you often find people put what they feel are their most important achievements on LinkedIn. So that can give you a good insight into the psyche of the individual. Also, it will also show you how much experience they've had in different places. And then also look to how long they've actually been with the organisation that you're sitting on the board for. Are they new themselves? Have they been there for 7-10 years? Could they feel like how I felt, cautious at the beginning, don't want to be telling anyone how to suck eggs? Or do they have a load of preconceived ideas about the organisation, and actually, there's some messaging there that you need to very subtly evolve, but you could inadvertently cause offence because they've been there a long time. You need to kind of sometimes lay down some little breadcrumbs of thought. People can quite often be far more receptive to an idea if they feel it's something that they've almost grown in their own mind, rather than you've done the Hansel and Gretel trail of breadcrumbs. That can often win far greater buy-in to changing perceptions than you just standing there going, well, I think we should do this. You normally want to just set a scene and let that kind of process evolve. So in addition, you want to look at how some of these individuals conduct themselves. Are they more formal? Are they kind of people where I'm quite happy to be interrupted? Some people take massive offence if you interrupt them. So again, that getting to know them, what is how they like to be conducted in that actual room can be quite an easy place to make a mistake. And as I mentioned before, do they like interpreting data? Do they want to support? So I found it quite interesting at the moment. So in the boardroom where I've mentioned, there are 2 people who are very heavily financed. I then have someone who is incredibly experienced as a director, who is more on the sales and marketing side. So, I need to be able to pitch finance messages that don't irritate individuals who have lots and lots of experience, but also give the messaging in a way to someone who doesn't really normally look at the numbers. That is quite a balance. And I think the only way you can get that right is when you pull your finance pages together, just do that really, really simple thing of always having that takeaway comment. You have that takeaway comment on the board, on the page of every slide you've got. But make sure when you're talking in the board, you're talking to that one comment. It's your anchor. It's the main reason you presented that page. And then not only does it help individuals who don't really know the finance pages, they think, great, that's what I'm supposed to take away. Whereas those finance individuals who are all over the numbers can come away thinking, okay, that's what is seen as the most important thing to this business at this moment. So it can create kind of some debate about whether that it should be the priority or not, rather than, well, why are we talking about this? And so it's just, you can do this in a really, really subtle way without having to sort of feel like you've got one slide for one person and one slide for somebody else. Because I think your board decks would all get very, very long if you had to do it that way around. Do we also want to think about the industries that these individuals have had experience in? Are there areas where you can ask them whether they've experienced it somewhere else in an organisation where they've been on a board before? You can get incredible, strong, rich information and support in board meetings from individuals who've seen a different practice done somewhere else. So open questions are not a bad thing. Going to a boardroom with a question where you can get some really good debate going. Non-execs are there to provide insight and thought to assist the company. So as long as you're not asking how do you debit and credit something, I think you're okay in asking a question. So don't be fearful of doing that in the way that Malcolm, I think it was you who said earlier about going back and asking for feedback. You can ask people questions and you can do it in the boardroom, because that debate can be really, really rich for information. If we look at kind of also then, moving on to sort of this governance structure, board meetings will differ significantly in terms of how they actually run themselves. What sort of organisation are you? Are you a limited company? Are you a PLC? Are you an LLP? Consider who your owners are. Have you got major shareholders, financial institutions? Is it private individuals? Is it family members, employees? This to some extent will guide quite significantly kind of how the boardroom is structured. I have an incredibly interesting dynamic at Adnams. Being a PLC, we're traded on AQSE. We have all the requirements that PLCs need to meet in terms of what they cover in boardrooms and what we have to demonstrate are covered in boardrooms. But we also have significant family shareholdings, and those shareholdings are represented in the boardroom. So that can bring about some really interesting dynamics. You take something like dividend policy. If you've got a significant shareholder in the room, and then you've got people who are, invested in the company in terms of their longevity in the business, but they don't necessarily own more than 5 shares. Getting the balance right can be an interesting thing to achieve. But again, knowing that dynamic means you don't inadvertently walk into a bit of a car crash. Know how these kind of aspects are represented in that boardroom, and then you'll be able to understand how that dynamic can play out for you. You then got things like all the different committees that might report into the board. We all know you normally have a finance and audit committee, you might have a REMCO, you might have a nominations committee, or with these startup companies, you won't have any. So where you don't have any of these committees, you'll find potentially the level of detail and depth of data you have to go into a boardroom could be significantly more than what you're used to, or indeed it needs to be more than what you would like to be doing in a boardroom. If you've got lots of committees, actually the boardroom will be quite high level, and you'll be getting those committees presenting stuff back and you're effectively ratifying what they're suggesting. And also you need to understand the people that are in those committees, what role are they on the board, if they are on the board. So someone who's a chair of one of those committees who is on the board will obviously have a much greater insight into the data, into anything that you discuss that could remotely link to something that might be discussed in that committee. So you may be suggesting in a budget putting forward something like a pay review, and if you haven't spoken to the chair of the remuneration committee before you've gone into the boardroom, you're probably not going to have a good board meeting. So just understanding where there's support and who should be kind of spoken to beforehand that can also be incredibly helpful. There are potential areas of focus as well in terms of whether you've got, say, an ESG committee, that could massively drive the structure of how your board meetings thought. You might suddenly find all your financials or your strategy are having to be kind of directed in a way as to how it supports your ESG strategy. So being mindful of the time zone in your current environment can really help set the tone as to what you're presenting as well. And then finally, knowing the board, and the basics of the meeting itself. Do they meet monthly? Do they meet quarterly? Clearly, if you're meeting monthly, you're going to be probably closer in the detail than if you're meeting quarterly, because you've got a larger time period to cover. And how does that impact the plan? So if you're meeting quarterly, you've got to be thinking quite a long way ahead if you're going to need a board decision on something. You don't want to suddenly get to the point where you've got to make a decision on something, but you need board approval, and you don't really want to be sending out an email to the board. You want to have been able to present your case, set down the information, make it as clear and as understanding as possible. So, just a bit, it sounds really simple and kind of obvious, but the number of times I've seen things go wrong at board simply because someone hadn't appreciated, but we never meet in August. Those kind of things, it can mess up the rhythm of what certain departments are trying to deliver. So, and you might find something quite quick comes up. So we're in a period of a fantastic uncertainty, let's call it. Interest rates are rocketing up. I'm sure many of us haven't really spent any time thinking about interest rates. over the last 10 years. They've been bimbling along at 0.1, happy days, don't really need to think about it. Now suddenly base is at 1%. People probably need to act quite quickly in boardrooms as to whether they need to start reviewing treasury policies, what needs to be agreed, what needs to be signed off. And you don't want to probably think, I'm waiting a whole quarter of the year before I talk to the board about that. So, thinking about whether you can call a special meeting to talk through things like that is also something, you don't need to be afraid of breaking the rhythm of a quarterly routine if that's normally what occurs. And then you've got formal, informal, stand up, sit down, stand at the front of the room. How do you address the chair? Do you address the chair as chairman or as a chair? All of that kind of, they're again really, really simple things, but they're very easy ways to upset the room, lose your train of thought, get it wrong, or maybe it's a more relaxed boardroom and everyone has a little chuckle in your show. So it depends on how the scene is set. But it's the whole kind of just knowing the board and how it works, just the general kind of day-to-day bit of it is often again something that just is overlooked, and you don't spend any time thinking about it. Then I wanted to cover a little bit around the relationship with the CEO. So you'd like to think, you have a good, I'm assuming people have good relationships with their CEOs, or they at least know what their relationship with their CEO is. So CEOs are often dynamic characters. They're there, they're thought provokers, they're leading the business. They can be 10,000 feet up in the air, and it's down to the rest of the executive to deliver that strategy and that plan. Or do you have a CEO who's genuinely interested in the financial drivers, wants to understand how that can be entwined through the strategy, or do they just sort of see that as a sort of a bit of that's something else for someone else to worry about? I've got the strategy here and I'm delivering it. Let's get the pieces together. So, do you need to link some of your topics that you're wanting to talk through into the CEO? So one of the things that I will always do for a board meeting is chat to the CEO here, read through anything that he's presenting. And then I'll be thinking, well, I'm going to be talking on this, and this. It'd be good. It might be a good one if you could tee it up here. That would be really helpful, because that can elevate your own pitch as to what you're talking about. It makes you look like a coordinated executive. It helps the non-execs feel you're all working together as opposed to individual soap boxes, which is never a place you really want to find yourself in. But presenting as a united team helps everybody feel that you're an effective executive. You also need to know how you understand each other's roles and personalities and interplay with one another. So, do you bounce ideas off while you're presenting? You almost interrupt each other, but really you're reversing what each one is saying. Or do you stay decidedly quiet and you would never interrupt? Everybody has their own style, but be aware of what that style is to ensure that you deliver your messaging and the CEO's messaging as effectively as possible. One of the things I found that is really unique with CEOs is whether they are comfortable with finance directors showing real golden nuggets of information. You might have looked at some financial data. It gives you some great insight into some past performance. So that enables you to shape future activity of how the business look to do something. Now, some organisations that's fantastic, the CFO present, and some organisations that doesn't work, and it's better that the CEO presents that. I don't think we need to be getting hung up on the fact that it's the CFO who found that golden nugget. We need to get hung up on the fact of how we deliver the right thing to business. So, work out what message is the best message to be delivered by whom. And again, sounds really simple. If you really reflect back as to how you work in boardroom, are you doing that? Or maybe you haven't even thought about it and you're all furiously scribbling away, but I can't see you on the screen, so I don't know. But ultimately, if you need board approval, you've got to use everybody's own qualities to get these messages out. You don't have to pigeonhole things as the CFO's responsibility or the COO's responsibility or head of HR. It is the exec's responsibility, collectively and jointly. Conscious no one's interrupting, but I guess everyone's feeling they're having a great time. But, you know, I'll keep going.
I don't know about other people. I'm sometimes finding it a bit difficult to hear you, and it's really strange because when you sit further to the your left, it's easier to hear you when you're that side. So
oh, apologies. I don't know. That's really strange because my mic's in the middle of my laptop. But anyway,
it is strange. I'll let you get on.
Thank you for the heads up. Where was I?
Sorry, Jenny, can I just ask a quick question while we're in between subjects? Talking about your relationship with the CEO and other board members as well, have you or anybody else experienced a situation where that leader has changed and that dynamic has changed?
Yep.
And trying to keep the balance with the existing board and the way that you've built that relationship and that way of reporting and getting information across to somebody who has a very, very different attitude to finance.
Yes, I think it's fair to say I probably wear a few scars from that experience. That is actually one of the examples that I was wanting to share. So I was in a scenario where the CEO that I was working with was quite strategic, high level, liked to kind of make a start to the meeting, present where we were going, how that had worked in the last month, where we were making changes in the future, and then would very much hand over to me to actually show how that had played out in the financials. That individual then moved elsewhere. It was in a really large organisation, so lots of different legal entities. They then moved roles, and the individual who came in always insisted on sharing financial data in their own slot, if you like, in the CEO report, and that financial data never tied up with mine, and they wouldn't share their report even with me before going into the meeting. So after a couple of meetings where it basically called into question how, like you say, how the board would function, they just didn't know where to go with this when you've got the CEO and CFO both presenting different numbers. And naturally, even though I'd been CFO for some time there and done it, they will follow the CEO as the, more senior person in the room, and then they would look questioningly at me as if to say, but how did we manage to believe all your numbers before? And that's really hard because it feels incredibly personal, but at the same time, you've got to make this work. So one of the things I did was, obviously I'd always say, well, I'll be circling back to find out where the differences are, and I can highlight that to, all those basic kind of things. I had a number of sessions with the CEO where I said, look, we're not doing ourselves any favors here with this approach. We don't look like, we know what we're doing in front of the board. That individual was insistent that they were going to continue reporting the numbers how they were, and they weren't going to change. So that was quite challenging. So what did I do about it? I spent some time working out where these numbers were coming from, because they weren't coming from finance, but they were being reported as financial numbers. Then how did I go about how I reported that in the board without actually highlighting that the CEO was wrong, which obviously is something that you can't do. So it was about, but luckily for me, where the numbers were coming from were different places. So one was like from a CRM system, and one was what the financially reported numbers are. So I could sit there and say, these numbers are absolutely absolutely correct. They're from the CRM system. It's mid-month. The numbers haven't closed. There aren't accounting adjustments made to them, etc., etc. So then people felt that those numbers being presented were like the stepping stone that then led and landed into my numbers. So in that regard, I managed to get the board to agree and understand my numbers, be happy that the two sets of numbers could be different and were acceptable. And I still never won over that CEO. And probably if I went and spoke to them this day, probably still haven't. Some problems you can't win. And I don't think you can fight them. What you have to do is work around how you deal with those differences and then articulate them in a way that is not defensive for yourself or antagonistic for the individuals that are receiving that information. So it's okay to admit that, hey, the meetings are in a different set now. You can see that we've got a change of kind of leadership here. I'd call the spade. You know, if there's a change in members, we have to say, well, the board is now different and the dynamic will change. And over the next few months, we're going to see how the meetings evolve from where they were. I don't think that's a bad thing. Changes can give a fresh perspective. I mean, Mary, I mean, you know, is that something that is, have you got board members where you can talk openly like that, or do they feel quite that it's all different?
Yeah, I think most of them, they are. And, you know, you spend a lot of your energy, as you've demonstrated in your slides, building those relationships, getting that confidence. And it's not so much about a conflict in data, more about a conflict in understanding importance of certain financial information.
Oh.
So a new person has come in, and I don't think that they particularly see the importance. So it's trying to still get that message across to the others, whilst almost being blocked by this other individual who doesn't consider it very important. So it's good.
Risk can be a very useful angle to take in that situation.
Yeah, that is one I've been using, and
yeah,
he does step back then and sort of go very quiet when I use that language. But I don't want to be threatening. I don't want to come across as I need to work on that relationship, and I need to develop that with him. So it's just you know, as you said, it's taking it offline and trying to I guess approach him in a way so that let's just work out what we want to see, what we want to demonstrate, how much information you want to give to the rest of the board, whilst not depriving the rest of the board of the information that they need.
I think that's probably one angle that could be really useful for you there, though, appealing to that individual who is new in that room and say and explain how other individuals in the room place a significant amount of importance on this particular area. And whilst at the moment, you know, it might seem less important to that person, other people there aren't there on that messaging. And if there is a bit of a change of mindset that is required, helping that individual realise that he's going to have to take everyone on that journey with them, or maybe it's a journey he shouldn't take and he just needs to actually realise that it's important, but positioning it that, hey, you're the new one, I'm helping you here, you know, because he or she doesn't know what was discussed before.
No.
And so that could be a really helpful way of sort of saying, I think there's a couple of members who are feeling a bit confused. We spent quite a lot of time focusing on this, whereas now we're not. They need us to explain, well, why are we not? Why is it? You can't just turn around and say, well, we were wrong for years to be discussing it. That's not how you can cover it, is it? So that might be an angle you can use, but unfortunately, you've probably got some painful one-to-one meetings to get through. To win the individual over, but you know, you've got to look united I think you've got to look united in terms of approach in a boardroom. That doesn't mean everybody has to agree with each other, but your approach has got to be similar, hasn't it? Because otherwise it can get a little bit dysfunctional. Maybe asking one of the Neds to ask that individual something outside of the meeting. You can almost, you know, allyship is always quite a helpful way of going about things too. There may be another individual at board who might want to help you champion this particular aspect and get some buy-in.
True. Yeah, good. Thanks.
I was going to suggest that, Jenny, because I think the Neds are often not underutilized, and they have a lot of skill, and therefore using the Neds, and because you can always learn from them. If they're good Neds, you know, you do get bad Neds, obviously, but most Neds, you know, normally have been there and got the scars themselves and can be useful in that, you know, in that way. They
are often also generally being Neds, they're less emotionally attached, and so they'll just be far more black and white about it, which I think can be incredibly helpful. They can remove emotion out of a conversation incredibly effectively, I think, and I've seen that many times.
Jenny, can I ask a question about how a CFO can be more strategic in a board meeting rather than just to be seen as a bean counter? Without stepping on the toes of the CEO.
Yeah, I think that links to the point about when you find that golden nugget of data and you suddenly think, oh, if only we'd realised this earlier. And then you sort of think that could help us, you know, look, it's say in manufacturing, for example, you know, you could find something when you're looking at data, trying to find patterns, looking at how costs link to particular processes, for example, that can have a very practical kind of impact on the finances and the strategic direction of a business. You know, do you look to do this in-house, or actually if you did it externally, it might cost a bit more, but it minimises the risk of, I don't know, the number of line failures or substandard products, wastage, things like where you can get something that's driven by a number, but actually practically ends up in changing how you operate. That can be massively strategic, because your operations are normally kind of a fundamental part to how the business is looking to grow over the next 5 years. That kind of, so sometimes it's about finding a lever of information to help you kind of get a way in, and then you can be insightful. So I think the CFO needs to be, in order to be strategic, they need to be insightful, and insightful will never step on a CEO's toes. It will assist, but in terms of who delivers the insightfulness, that might be that you give it to the CEO and then he or she runs with it, and you might just have to take one for the team and realise that you found it, but they're going to deliver it. But you know, all of that thing, I'm a good believer in karma. All of that thing comes around in the end. But I think, you know, finding those levers and insight, rather than, I think strategic is an overly used word. I'm conscious I've used it in my slide deck, but I think strategic makes it feel like this nebulous, unknown thing that, oh, I'm not a creative person, I do numbers, and people think strategy is creative. I think strategy is common sense and insightfulness. And finance, guys, you know, we've got all the numbers in front of us. We've got all that brilliant historical data that can help us understand what we can do in the future. We are absolutely in the sweet spot for being able to be insightful and deliver good strategy. Any other questions while we're at this nice kind of little convenient lull? Okay. Can everyone still hear me all right? Can someone wave? All right. Yeah, good. Thank you. Okay, so we talked a bit about the relationship, your relationship with the CEO, etc. I think one other aspect that I haven't covered in terms of the relationship with the CEO is how supportive the CEO is in terms of how they want you to grow. So, you know, if you have a CEO who sees you as growing, as incredibly helpful to that CEO, they will have a different network from yours. That again could help address some kind of helping yourself feel more strategic. They can put you in touch with other people who aren't necessarily just finance. Even, you know, they can even give you one-on-one sessions, or you can give them one-on-one sessions. You know, finding that kind of growth mindset in the individual is really important. And if you can get that embedded in your relationship with the CEO, I would say you're very lucky, and grab it while you can, because not every CEO is of that mind. Then I think the next section I wanted to cover was all around the company itself, a bit of its history, what's shaped it, what's moulded it. Before you arrived in the boardroom, there will likely have been loads of relevant history shaping that business, and all the individuals' outlooks in that boardroom. Depending on how long you've been there, you know, you may be a part of the history and then you joined into the boardroom, so you know a lot of it, or you may be new to the organisation, you don't know any of it. Or indeed, many boardrooms are quite secretive places and nobody really knows what people talk about in there, and so you don't know any of it. But you need to kind of consider that scene set of the company. What are the basic elements of that organisation? You know, is it well established? Is it in a growth phase, a recovery phase? I guess a lot of people are feeling a bit in recovery phase at the moment, post the pandemic. Or are you still in loss-making phase? Are you consolidating? Are you acquiring? Are you defensive? You know, that can have a massive impact in terms of how you're positioning your numbers and how receptive people are to some of the things that you may be suggesting. Or indeed, it tells you, I'm not going to suggest that yet. We're not in the right place. I'm going to park it and use, you know, wait 6 months till it's a more appropriate time, because you need buy-in. You know, what kind of, I've already mentioned before, the type of company you are, PLC, limited, etc. You know, that can obviously have quite a big impact into how you do things, and the industry you operate in. You know, or indeed, you operate in more than one industry. Here at Adnams, we don't really, you know, you sort of think we're hospitality, but we make beer, we make gin, you know, we have web sales, we have shops. So are we retail? Are we manufacturing? Whenever I get one of those forms to fill in to say what industry I'm in, I just sit there and think, I don't know. but the breadth of the industries you're in can have a massive impact, because one or the other might be doing better or worse, or there's something going on in one particular industry that impacts part of your business or all of your business. So understanding those dynamics can be incredibly powerful for you. You've then also got things like kind of, how connected are they to organisations like the CBI or kind of more lobby group kind of aspects? What sort of intel can you get to and from government? Can that help? Let's be honest, the furlough scheme didn't come about because the government sat in a room on its own and thought about what can they do to help business. They were petitioned quite heavily and were given lots of insight about what could assist businesses. And I think many, I think it's fair to say many businesses benefited significantly from furlough during that pandemic. So it was well worth understanding what to do. Talking at Boardroom about how involved you want to be in that kind of area can be quite important. And to the point about, how can you be strategic? Actually, where you kind of talk to government and stuff, that's where finance can be incredibly strategic, because your numbers will aid government on some of the decisions they make, and indeed how useful some of the things you could suggest could be. So that can be quite a powerful aspect to consider. Then you've got things like kind of, are you an ESG kind of organisation? How relevant is that to your industry? If it isn't relevant yet, I would question it probably needs to be. But certain aspects of your organisation will find elements easier or more challenging to meet in the ESG agenda. And maybe there's some funding available for that too. You've also then got, how impactful are you in the local community? Do you worry about the local community? Do you all work remotely, so that's just not a thing? Or like us, do you kind of, have heavy kind of tankers going in and out of the small town that upsets tourists and other businesses, but ultimately you're a draw for the town because you're here? So it's a bit of a, like anything, it's a fine balance. And then you've got the kind of, are you international? Are you national? Are you just a very small local geographic? How does that impact you? How big is your company in terms of turnover, employee number, profitability level? I mean, this list is just endless when it looks at actually kind of the company itself. What's your brand like? Or you might not have a brand. So, so a really strong brand can massively dictate how you actually find yourself having to answer financial decisions, or it might not feature at all. And moving from one organisation to another can kind of feel incredibly different. And then you've got specific historical events that occurred in that company. Did they try and do something once before and it all fell flat on its face? And then you're just walking in bold as brass suggesting, let's try this, without realising that's been done before and it didn't work. And what did we learn? How could you then actually present that to get a yes rather than an automatic reflex no? They can be very, very key aspects, rich picking grounds for assistance in when you're wanting to present something. And then when we look at, I've mentioned business strategy as a word I don't really particularly like, so let's call it insight and plans. I'm going to state the real obvious here, and it's the fact that, when you look at business strategy, why do people automatically look at the financial plan? That's not business strategy, and it's not the CFO's requirement to just have to present some numbers. You need the vision, the objectives, how it's all going to be delivered, the insight and what the company believes it's going to be doing in the future. Where does it want to go? What are those stepping points? What are those key milestones you're going to have to deliver? And that's what you then hang kind of a 5-year plan of numbers against, and hopefully your budget can conveniently drop out of that as well. But, in many organisations I've been in, I found myself being told to set out the business plan. And you sort of think, like, that feels kind of a strange place to go. So it's really important that in the boardroom, you can get kind of a connection with those members that understands through collaboration, you can pull together what is a strong business strategy, and then you can develop some numbers. You can't do the numbers first. And I know all of you will know that, but I'm sure some of you have been in the situation where you've been asked to present a business plan without any kind of preamble and understanding what that organisation is going to do to achieve it. And also, the CEO is there as the key driver. I mean, I see the CEO's role as the key driver in that plan and that strategy. And you're almost a critical friend. So you can sort of take some of that strategy bring up some numbers, and then go, that didn't quite give the bottom line we really needed. You know, you lock yourself away for a bit, you talk to different parts of the organisation, you're toing and froing, and you're making sure that you can grow something that is actually believable, doable, sustainable, achievable, all of those good kinds of things. And the boardroom, the main function of that boardroom is to ensure that the business stays on track for that business strategy. But that isn't just about meeting budget every year. That is about staying true to your, you know, your original vision, or evolving that vision, realizing it needs to change. I think the pandemic has enabled loads of companies to realize that actually, you know, we need to, you know, pivot change, or maybe it's just a very small, subtle change. But those kind of underlying visions and rationales and objectives of an organisation really need to be discussed at board. And we must always bring every decision that we make at board, you know, anything that's discussed, I think, should always be hung off that vision and that plan, because otherwise you can find yourself going off at a tangent and discussing things that probably aren't as relevant. So, I mean, I guess this kind of pulls to a close the presentation, or the ramblings that I wanted to give everybody into my insights from scars gained over the years of exciting experiences that I've achieved. And I guess I open it to the floor for any other observations or questions from the chat room.
Jenny, can I just gain your insight into, we've recently had, we set our strategy and business plan, etc. And after Q1, it was quite apparent that the gross profit margins weren't coming in. Reasons for that I've been discussing with CEO since month 1. So we brought it back to reality, which I think probably most people in this arena will be aware that often it's always finance's fault.
Absolutely, finance's fault when you don't deliver the numbers, but the business's achievement when they exceed them.
Absolutely. How do you deal with those situations? And obviously there's the continuing debate. You've got sales versus finance, because they promise the world and we want to keep it real. And then like you said earlier, it's in those situations, if the board aren't all collected, it's just so quick and easy to blame finance. How do you manage those situations without allowing it not to be personal, but to take it quite hard sometimes?
Well, the ultimate goal, I think, from what you said there, is that you need to be able to achieve, like, say, the budgeted profit level. And you're not going to achieve the budgeted profit level if you're constantly missing your targets. So I think, first of all, that whilst that's a really obvious statement, you're starting with that. We know as a business we want to achieve these profit targets. Right now we're not achieving them. We can see it's on our GP margins. Let's go back to basics. What aspect is it of the GP? And I think fact, underlying pure fact, backed up by examples, getting an individual from the sales team to come and present in the boardroom can be really, really powerful. So I think it's important that you don't always feel that the boardroom is only for board members.
Our board includes our sales director, and it kind of becomes a lot of try and mask what they contributed to the situation. I was quite clear on where we'd not achieved, and basically the sales team weren't putting the right date markup. So confusion between markup and margin, one of the elements, but they weren't putting the right markups on the new business. So it quickly got addressed. We've now put a stop to new business that isn't at the right level, and where it's not, the turnovers makes it not worth us doing. But it's in that heat of the moment, trying to get everyone to concentrate on the fact rather than being defensive.
Yeah, and I think it's absolutely okay in the board meeting where let everybody let off a bit of steam. Let them. We all know the adage: angry people don't listen. I think defensive people don't listen either. Let's think about. So you're in the boardroom. Everybody's getting a bit heated because they're all feeling a bit defensive, bit of finger pointing going on. Let a bit of that play out, and then I would just literally say, everybody, look, and you have to draw a line under it and say, everybody, and maybe that is your CEO rather than the CEO. It's probably better coming from the CEO and the CFO. Yeah. And the CEO has to stand there and basically say, look, we can understand that we've highlighted some reasons why this has already happened, but we need to actually look to achieving the best EBITDA profit level that we can. And actually, this conversation right now is not helping us achieve that. And call it out and just say, guys, we've got to stop talking like this. We need to be looking at what are the physical steps, the practical steps that each function is going to take. And we are going to report back on each of those individual steps and break it down into bite-sized pieces of action. I think that's the only way you can stop everybody doing a bit of this. Because everybody knows blaming each other isn't going to help. But I think the CEO or the chairman, so, you know, whether your chair is non-exec or exec, you know, sometimes it can be great if a chair just turns around and tells everybody to stop being a bit childish. You know, and just kind of like drive what the business is there. That the board meeting is there to drive decent activity, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Resolve the issues, be realistic, and let's move forward.
Yeah, and every time any behaviour creeps up where it's starting to get, the chair can just turn around and say, oh, it's creeping back, everyone. Let's look forward. What are the actions we're taking? I know you need to look at what past performance was to understand what you might need to change. But, you know, you do that in one finance pack for that month, it's done. Then look forward, grab those actions. And as long as you're learning something from where that performance hasn't hit the mark and you're instigating clear action that you can talk about at board, you should be able to evolve away from the, oh, you're setting it too high, or we knew we'd never achieve that margin, you were just bonkers, blah, 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 and all of that sort of stuff. It's like, well, okay, if that margin is too high, what margin is achievable? What do we need to do to make that achieve that, right? If that's now the new margin, what do we then need to change elsewhere to make sure that we still hit the profit line? And I just make it factual action. Good luck. I feel your pain.
Well, I think we've come to the end of our time, I'm afraid, everybody. I'm sure you'll agree. That was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much for your time, Jenny, in presenting that and taking part today. I'd like to say that we do have a Guild app, which some of you may be already part of. There's about 800 odd finance director CFOs on this app, which is used as a professional platform for CFOs and FDs to often continue these conversations. So Christiane will be sending around an email with the link to that so that you can pose your questions, looking for any additional advice, etc., or messages and pointers. So yes, once again, thank you so much, Jenny.
That's all right.
Thank you.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Yes, it did, certainly did. Yeah, and thank you to everybody who's been able to join today. Hopefully we'll see you for our June event. Thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye all. Thanks for listening.